pray that you'll help us as we think about it and meditate on it and guide us. And pray this in Jesus' name. If you've got your Bibles, if you could turn to Leviticus 19. This is going to be the second half. All right, great, thank you. This is going to be the second half of how we think about using the Old Testament as Christians. And I was halfway here this morning, or not quite halfway here, when I realized that I had left my notes sitting at home. So if this isn't the smooth, efficient delivery that you're so used to, you'll know why. But we got the slides, so we should be okay. So last week we talked about a few things just by way of review. We talked about the fact that 613 laws can't govern a society. And so the laws that God gave them were intended to produce more in them than just an obedience of just simple one-for-one. Like in the gleaning laws that we're going to look at, there's more to it, as we'll see, than just simply let poor people pick some of your food. That the laws were designed to be combined with a heart that sought God, and those two things bridged this gap between just a legal behavior and an actual righteous behavior that was pursuing God. We talked about how the Pharisees tried to bridge that gap between those two by just enacting more laws. And so was protect the 613 laws by saying, wouldn't it be better if we did this? And so folks have done that all through the years. I don't want to upset anybody, but one of the ways it's been done is that there's no actual prohibition in the Bible against alcohol. But tons of Christians have said, well, we're not to be drunk, so wouldn't it be better if we don't drink alcohol at all? And that becomes the standard. It becomes the better standard. Does that make sense? And so that's how the Pharisees did that. They took those laws and said, it'd be better if we do this. If we're not going to, this will be the Sabbath, let's do this. But what God is looking for is that heart devoted to Him that's obeying out of the relational desire for Him. Then we talked about how they started before Calvin, but Calvin really popularized it, that this is really a wonderful way to grasp the law conceptually, but it's a bit simple. And so its simplicity is its beauty, in that we can understand, we can try to grasp some of the complexity of the law, but that when we really try to understand a law in its context, it doesn't have all that it needs for us. And so I proposed that we take a method that Chris Wright came up with at first, and this was the method that I used in my thesis, that for any Old Testament law that we take, the first thing that we look at are the theological aspects of the law. How does this law fit in with what God had for His people, how He wanted them to be His covenant people? And so even a law like gleaning, we're going to see, is actually more theological than it is anything else. So what's the theology behind the law? Because the law is how Israel relates to its God. So that's one of the first concerns. The second one is social. How does the law impact how the Israelites treated each other? So right away you can see we've got the first two great commandments there, don't we? Loving God, loving your neighbor. And so those two elements are going to play into a law. And then the third one are the economics. How did it work out in their actual lives, impact how they lived? and what they did. So how do those three relate to each other? And right, well, how they all relate to each other is going to give us an idea of what the Israelites would have heard, particularly about the gleaning law that we're going to talk about, in their context of life. And so how do these three things fit together? And then we want to bring them into the New Testament. So Wright suggests a triangle because those three vertices, it can be, they're linked within that triangle. And so a law can be far more theological than it is social, or it can have a heavy social aspect and not as much economic. Not every law is going to have the same amount of stress on each of those angles, but they usually have some aspect because it was meant to be a covenant relationship with God with a people in real life. And so each of these is going to have something. And then we talked about the fact that once we've spent our time, done our due diligence on the Old Testament, that every law is going to have an aspect of fulfillment to it, that everything pointed to Jesus and he fulfilled it all. So how does this law actually flesh out then in the New Testament as the covenant is made new in him and it becomes channeled through him? What do we see the changes being? That make sense? So, here's the test case. When you reap the harvest of your land, don't reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Don't go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. And if you've got the text open in front of you, you can see the context is going to help us understand things, even though I don't have it up on the screen. But what do you notice about this? We mentioned a few things. Mark mentioned right away that this is a law that is aimed at land holders. That's extremely important. Anything else you notice?
Can we assume or infer that others outside of the covenant would do what this law says? That they would just take everything. They would harvest the edges. They would go back and pick up what's left behind. Aren't we to understand that every law that is given is to make God's people separate or holy from the rest? So can we infer that the practice of not doing this is the practice of those around them? Or is that...
No, actually, there were laws safeguarding the poor that the other nations had.
The other nations had that as well?
I'm not saying, I don't know if they had this one in particular, but they did have laws to protect the poor. I'm not sure if they had laws to protect foreigners coming in, but there were laws. So I don't think I guess the answer is I don't think it's a safe assumption that the other nations didn't care about their poor.
But something about this is to make God's people separate, God's people different.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yep.
I think from using the kind of economic aspect of it, where you keep the landowner is sacrificing something for the sake of the poor, because God has to.
Yep. Absolutely right, yeah. Yeah, and I know you weren't trying to be precise there, so I'm not correcting you, but I would say it's more than God asking them to. He's telling them. And I know you weren't trying to parse that out, but I think that's an important distinction. He doesn't say, hey, listen, I'd like you to do this. He's saying, you do this.
The commandment is amazing. And also, God's blessings don't come unless we obey. And so that doesn't leave an opening if we want to please God and do what God says. We
Right.
have to obey. And that's obedience is reasonable.
Kind of critical, isn't it? Yep. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, you're right on track with this, Jen. Yes. Yes, that's extremely important too. These are all great observations that are all true. So she just said that for somebody to do this is an act of worship. It's an act of obedience, but it's also an act of worship for who God is. Anything else you notice?
One place is you don't pick up all the forgiveness. Most things are forgiveness. Sometimes you see that, but also the way they work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really important too. So it's not it's not a system to promote dependency, but rather it's a provision of opportunity. Somebody else had their hand up?
Yeah, I did, but I was going to say the same thing. I probably said a little bit differently. There's something special about working for what you get, as opposed to what we see in America, where you get entitlement out of getting stuff. You have it's just a tremendous lack of appreciation among the community that gets for nothing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and this is a point that I'd like to stress later on along those lines, but implicit in that is somebody didn't have to do this. If you were poor, nobody is saying you must go do this. This is an opportunity, and what it's an opportunity for, I think, is really the power of the.
You know the term for the word foreigner there, is that like, because I know there's different Hebrew words for sojourner, foreigner, alien, different things like that, but is that somebody who is planning on like becoming an Israelite, or is that somebody who's passing through, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that somebody that's going to try to like get into the covenant
Mm-hmm.
with the Israelites?
They could. They could. This is the NIV, which has foreigner. I think your ESV and the CSB have resident alien, which might go farther.
NASB has sojourner.
Sojourner, yeah. Which gives sojourner might be a little, in our minds, is more of a temporary thing.
Yeah.
Whereas I think what the resident alien is really what, this is a person who's come to live in Israel. Yeah. So let's look at a few of these. A lot of these you're going to recognize because you just said them, but there's some important ones. So what can we say about this theologically? Well, the first one is look at verse 2. Speak to the entire assembly of Israel. So this is nationwide. Be holy, because I am holy. I'm the Lord your God, I'm holy. So right away, this aspect, and just a few verses later, is about the imitation of God. That Israel's supposed to do this because of the character of their God. And so there's something about leaving the grain in your field that imitates God. And we've got to figure out what that is. It also happens then at the end of the passage, a motivation statement. I am the Lord your God. Why do you do it? Because that's who I am, and I said so. And so it's more than just do what I say. It's actually, this is coming from me in some way. This reveals who I am. And so this law is not just simply economic. It's framed by statements that this somehow expresses who God is. The third one is it presupposes God keeping his land promise. He promised to Abraham that he would give him the land. And this is assuming that they will have entered the land and when you harvest your land. So it's assuming that God is going to keep the promises that he made from Abraham. So all of a sudden now, we're on one of the big 3, 4, if we want to include the great name, the big 3 promises that God made to Abraham. So this law just kind of exploded, didn't it? This is no longer just something about harvesting some grain. This is actually about God keeping the promises that are essentially the storyline of the Bible. In Leviticus 25, and if you're at all interested, or if you're not, this is actually the chapter that I spent my time on when I was studying. It says, "The land is not to be permanently sold because it is mine, and you are only aliens and temporary residents on my land with me." Rob, I'm sorry, I don't know what version I used. But you can see the aliens, temporary residents, that whole, the terms are different versions used, but it's the same words, yeah. And so you live on the land with me. You're to allow the redemption of any land you occupy. If your brother becomes destitute and sells part of his property, his nearest relative may come and redeem what his brother has sold. That's the kinsman redeemer there. That's that person he's talking about. Had other jobs as well. But if somebody had a hailstorm come through, if they were up in the highlands and it knocked out their crop and all of a sudden they have nothing to eat for the next year and they have to sell part of their property, it was the nearest relative's job to come back and if he was at all able to do it, to help him redeem that property back from who he had sold to so that it stayed in the family that it had been given to. And so there's a tremendous value, I mentioned last week, that a huge portion of Joshua is just simply the boundaries of the land that was given. Land is one of the main characters in the law of Moses. It's what the promise is. It's, as we'll see, it's a paradigm of Eden itself. And so owning land meant you were one of God's people. And so it wasn't to be lost, and families helped each other get back to it because that was proof that you belonged to Israel and that you were participating in the promises of God. God says, if you follow me, your land will have bounty. Make sense? So land is deeply important to them in a way that it's not to us. You know, I get a job offer in Atlanta. I don't want to go to Atlanta, but that's the example. We don't have any problem putting a for sale sign outside of our house and moving to Atlanta. Ancient Jews would never do that because their house, their property, had been given to them by God and it was supposed to stay in the family forever. Make sense? So it's part of their covenant relationship.
I was just thinking that really makes the judgment of God on them when they were driven out of the land even more difficult than we could accept.
That's right. Because the land is the place of relationship. It's not just, I'm going to give you a place to live. He says in Leviticus 26, I'm going to take you there where I can walk with you, which is what he did in Eden. Where I can give you food, which is what he did in Eden. Where I can be your God and you can be my people, which was the design of you. So the land was the place of relationship. So when he kicks them out, what's it say? The relationship is over. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. This chapter of Leviticus 25 is the year of the Jubilee. So every 50th year, the land reverted back to the original family. So if you sold, so let's say you have some property, you fall in hard times, and it's it's 10 years until the Jubilee. You come to me and you say, hey, you want to buy my property? Actually, what I'm doing is buying 10 years of harvests, because after 10 years, I have to give it back to you. So the price is going to be much less than if you come to me in year 48. There's 48. I'm going to have to pay a lot more because I got 48 years. But the land could not stay owned by anyone, outsider or insider, past that 50-year mark. It went back to the original family, which is the return back to that relationship. No matter what happened to you, your land came back to you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just completely understanding some of the numbers, and that was just from outside. We recognize you as you do. We told them possible. You're not ever going back. That's just something that you know, use whatever phrase, the legal language.
Right.
It would be part of the contract.
Yes. And it would presuppose that everybody in Israel is functioning according to the law. Now, if you read this story, remember when Ahab kills some guy whose name I can't remember? He wants him to sell his vineyard, and he says, no, this is my property, it's my family property. How can I sin against God doing that way? And Jezebel says, I got a way. And they kill him. Right? So the land laws were abused, but this is how it was supposed to be. So land being a huge topic, you see, it was owned by God, it was his, and the Israelites were the resident aliens on his land, as we just saw. And as I just mentioned, land gathered its meaning from Eden, that was the place of relationship that God had placed his people. That's where he wanted them. And so in returning to Eden, the promised land, is a picture of returning back, a land flowing with milk and honey, where God will be with them. It's a type of return to Eden that's only completed with our Lord Jesus, obviously. It was given, the land was given to God by the tribes, the families. It was their portion. So when you read in Psalm 16 that my boundaries have fallen in pleasant places, what he's saying is, I was given a great tract of land, and that's my portion. The Levites did not get a land portion. God himself is serving him, and and the gifts and the food offerings from the tabernacle, that was the portion of the Levites. So they didn't get land, but everybody else did. As we just said, portion was to be retained by the original family forever, and kinsmen were supposed to help. So you can see right away that if he's speaking to landowners, this is not just simply an economic statement. This is a deeply theological statement. So on top of that then, Deuteronomy 24 says that you do the same thing. It's a reiteration of this law, but to remember that you were aliens in Egypt, and I came and got you. And so again, it's within the realm of redemption of what God has said. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. So what God has done for them, they are to do for each other. Last thing I will point out is that the peace offering strangely comes right before it. That God says, when you sacrifice a fellowship offering, it's a different word, but peace offering, fellowship offering, sacrifice it in such a way. We don't need to get into the details of that law, except to say that the context is so important, because the fellowship offering is where God gives the people of his food. They bring him an offering that belongs to him, and he says, you take part of it and eat it with me. And so, again, it's the context that this is something that the Israelites are doing because of their relationship with God, because of what God has done for them in imitation of him. He gives them of their food, his food, and they then share theirs. Does that make sense? So the whole context wraps it up in their relationship with God. And this is when you offer a fellowship offering, sacrifice to the Lord. This is what he tells them to do. So the social angle addresses Landowners, we just saw that. Native Israelites with land tenure. And we've seen now the social and the theological heavily overlap right at this point, so you can't split them apart. The poor were Israelites who had met difficult circumstances, lost their land, could have been wild animals. I remember in Africa talking to some farmers once, and they were saying that their whole crops had come up. They were just about to harvest them, and a herd of elephants came through and just destroyed the whole thing. So I'm pretty sure they didn't have elephants in Israel, but other animals could have done something similar. There could have been natural disasters, could have been things like that. Could have been thieves, any sort of thing. And then this in particular, Rob, to yours, this one, there's two words. This one I think is ger, someone who's come to join or live in the community and borders. They were often tradesmen, merchants, that could have been refugees, but they were landless. And if they were tradesmen and gained money and an Israelite needed to sell it, that's addressed in Leviticus 25:2. But the land would have to revert back. And Ruth, the story of Ruth, is just, that's what this is all about. It's a beautiful story. And interestingly, this is a command to an individual about the community. So this is to the individual farmer, but it addresses the health and the function of the community of God. So that's a fascinating aspect too, isn't it? Economic. There are 4 prohibitions regarding the 2 harvests. So it says here that you don't reap to the very edges. That's one. You leave it. And you don't gather the gleanings, the stuff that's dropped. So when they cut them, they had those little hand sickles, and they would grab the wheat and cut it with a sickle. And anything that would have fallen when they did that, that was the gleanings, and they weren't to pick it up. And they weren't to go to the edge of their field. And so those are 2 different prohibitions. The same with the grapes. They weren't supposed to go over a second time. So you harvested once when the grapes were ripe, and you didn't go back to get what you missed. And then also any grapes that had fallen you don't pick up. So there's 2 different prohibitions. The one in Deuteronomy also adds olives in there. So thinking back to that gap thing, this is not what actually some of the rabbis said, which is simply produce, grapes, and olives, nothing else. But I think that what God is saying here is you are to be generous with what you have, and that would involve any crop plant, barley, wheat, whatever you're growing. How wide was the edge strip to be? That's going to depend on the heart of the farmer, isn't it? And the rabbis actually addressed this. They said that to fulfill this law, what was left had to be 1/60th. I don't know how they came up with that. But they also said, let wisdom be your guide. If you have a field that's so rural that nobody shows up, and you leave a strip along your edges, you're obeying the law, but you're wasting food because nobody's going to come. On the other hand, if it's heavily populated and you're going to have a lot of gleaners, you might want to, like Boaz, his field was right near Bethlehem, and so he probably, knowing him, left it a little wider because there were numerous people who needed it. And so it's going to depend not on legislation, but on that heart that seeks to honor God. As Lauren brought out, the owner bears the cost. It's his profit margin that's being, and it's not a handout, but it was to protect dignity, and protect dignity in a theological way, as we'll see in just a second, that allowed the poor and the foreigner access. It also wouldn't allow them to bring grain offerings. So if you didn't have anything, you could glean, and there's provisions in the sacrifices for those who are too poor to bring anything but grain. This was a way for somebody to actually be able to participate in the worship of Israel, even if they had nothing. And as I mentioned, the story of Ruth depends on Boaz's righteous obedience to this law. So there's a lot of different economic things that are going on. It is about food, but it's more than just food. So what can we draw some conclusions from the Old Testament on this? Sorry, I'm hurrying, but we're running out of time. The Israelite farmer was to God what the resident alien was to the farmer. Right? God says, this is my land, you're resident alien on it. Therefore, you play my role and let the resident alien come in and get food. And so this is imitation of God at its finest. You do to them what I have done to you. And that's part of the Deuteronomy thing. Remember who you were and what I did. And that's why I'm telling you to do this. So providing access to the produce of the promised land was to provide access to the relationship with God that it symbolized. If you were landless, how do you know that you were part of God's people? Because God's people had been given land. And what this is saying is you allow them access into this land. You get to have them come in and actually gain their food the same way that you gain yours, by harvesting my provision to my people. That make sense? So the same way that God deals with the farmer is how the farmer is dealing by providing access into this land. The relationship that Israel has with you get to participate in this because you're a resident alien just like I am. And maybe this is my property, but I'm bringing you in. And so they truly are their brother's keeper. And providing for them not just food, but access to the theological import of land and of God's promises to provide food. Yeah, because it was a tribal culture, which we touched on last week. Yeah. To a degree, yes. There were restrictions that that an alien was not allowed to participate, say, in the Passover. In order to do so, they had to fully convert, become circumcised, if they were male, and fully convert over. But in general, remember that one of the differences is we don't live in a religious state like they did. So if you're a resident alien, you come in, you're expected to follow our rules. And whether that means they actually went to the tabernacle, I'd have to think about that a little more, about aliens coming in, because that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it goes back to what Lauren said, that I wanted to highlight that's so important. They didn't have to. So if they chose to, and if you're choosing to follow this law, then you better follow the other ones. That you're actually choosing to follow the way God wants his people to live. But they didn't have to. So the entirety of the law then was designed to have Israel celebrate what God had done for him, redemption, and second, to imitate him by doing the same thing for each other. And so the economics was certainly food. That's pretty obvious. But it was way more than that, wasn't it? It had to do with one's ability, whether one owned land in Israel or not, to participate in the relationship with God and with his covenant and with the promises that he made to his people. So it was a huge deal. And finally, gleaning was a way to share food that was promised and provided by God with the poor and the alien in a dignified way. but they didn't have to. It was a choice to follow God's laws, to become active participants in the covenant. And not fully in yet, but what we find out from the New Testament is, even though circumcision was such a big deal, that God was actually looking for something bigger than that. And this is dealing with the heart condition of why they would do things. Any questions on that? So that's kind of what that law was about. Now, how does Jesus expand it? We got 3 minutes for this. Plenty of that. Excuse me. Well, the first thing is, I think the New Testament maintains an emphasis on taking physical care of your brothers and sisters in the covenant. Jesus says, if you give a cup of cold water to one of the least of my brothers, one of the least of my people, I'm not going to forget it. You take care of it. 1 John 3 is a great one. If you see somebody and you don't help them, a brother and sister, somebody that belongs to Jesus with you, how can God's love be within you? So that the relationship with God is tied to the provision, just like we saw in the Old Testament. Same with James. Same with Luke. The Jews ask John the Baptist, what should we do? And he says, share your food. Take care of each other. So that's still there. The command wouldn't have been repeated a whole lot because it would have just been assumed, right? There's no abrogating it. You did it there, you do it now. What Jesus does, though, I think, and Paul do, is they instruct us that we are no longer just to simply see it just in God's people, but that we have an obligation to look out beyond. That because Jesus has become the king over all, that his authority is over all lands, not just the little strip along the Mediterranean, that all people are now his target. And so it's not the same level of obligation. We don't go out and say, okay, how can we solve all the world's problems? But just like the Good Samaritan, the reason that the Levite and the priest went by was because they didn't think they had any obligation to that man. And what Jesus says is, no. The Samaritan was the neighbor. You go and do likewise. You no longer get to think just within this boundaried community. My sights are bigger than that, and so are yours. Paul says that we do good to all people, especially the household of faith. We maintain that we need to take care of each other. That's part of what it means to be sons and daughters of God. But now we have an additional element that Jesus says, I want more than just that. It all belongs to me. As it was Abraham Kuyper, every square inch of the universe, Jesus says, that's mine. And so the obligation is moved out. And I want to be clear, I don't think it's the same. I don't think that it means we bear great cost, sell everything that we have to try to solve poverty in the third world, but we don't turn our eyes to it and not do anything about it either, and pretend that we don't have responsibility for it. Does that make sense? So it becomes a heart condition. I don't have any hard and fast rules on this for you because I don't see them given to us, except he's expanded it just beyond what the Jews would have thought of. And this is an interesting one. I'll close with this. For Paul, when you read about the offering that he was concerned about, the inclusion of the Gentiles in the spiritual blessings of the Jews meant for him that the Gentiles were now responsible. They owed it, what the NIV says. They owe it to the poor Jews to provide for them. That in doing this is a completion of this same thing that we see in Leviticus, where God's people are providing for each other because of their common familyness amongst God's people. And so Paul says that when the Gentiles give money to the Jews, it is proof of Paul's commission of bringing the Gentiles in. It is proof that God's people, Gentiles, are providing for God's people, Jews. It's like the reverse of Leviticus, where it's just all the Jews, right? But the Gentiles are actually participating fully in providing for God's people precisely because they're God's people and taking care of them within this covenant context. So, yeah, we don't have any time to, I was hoping that we'd have some time for like some interesting, what do we do in this context questions, but we don't. So, but any last final questions or comments? So I think that as we think through the Old Testament within its context and kind of distill down what they would have heard and how it would have been in there, and then see how Jesus expands it into the new, we can get some ideas of how we are to conduct ourselves, how we're to use our money for the sake of the kingdom, but also for the sake of evangelism. And going out and helping, loving our enemies, and not just being as boundaried as what the Jews were. Well, a lot more we could say, but that's our time. So let me close this in prayer. Father, thank you for your complexity and the power of your word. I pray, Lord, that you will help us to see all of our lives in relationship to you, in relationship to how you want your people to act and function. And so we thank you for your instruction, and may your Spirit give us wisdom and grace as we try to follow you and follow your Son in living it out. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.